So I've tested and reviewed quite a few ITX cases on this channel, and I think it's finally time that we look back and I let you guys know which ones are sort of the best ones that I've had the chance to review, and also which ones I recommend. So I think this list could be useful for those starting to look into building PCs and maybe moving to an ITX PC, a smaller case for example, where you don't really know what cases are available or what things to look out for. So just a quick heads up for those who might be new to the channel, when I'm reviewing cases, there are sort of two main things that I'm looking out for. The first one being space optimization. How is the hardware being utilized inside that case? I feel like if there's one thing that we can learn from the laptop and phone market, it's how to utilize that space efficiently. You wouldn't buy a phone, for example, that's a lot bigger than it needs to be, and you certainly wouldn't buy a laptop that's bigger than it needs to be. A desktop computer, I think, should be approached in a similar way. The second thing that I like to look out for is build quality, and personally, I like a full metal enclosure, aluminium preferably. Thicker panels are more preferable than thinner ones, and I really don't like plastic when it comes to a computer case. I'm going to separate this list into categories because each of these cases have their pros and cons. So we have the best budget case, the most compact case, the best performance case in terms of thermals, we have the best case for gaming, the best case when it comes to design, and then finally the best overall ITX case. So let's get started. And kicking things off with the ultra compact category, coming in at just 5 liters, we have the Skyreach 4 Mini, which in my opinion is the best, most compact case that I've had the chance to review. As I said, coming in at just 5 liters, there really is very minimal compromise when you consider how tiny this thing actually is. It's actually the first case that I've reviewed personally to easily fit into a regular sized backpack. Simply put, for a gaming system, I'd argue that you might not need anything more, to be honest. Now, when you first look at the Skyreach 4 Mini, the first thing to assume is a ton of compromise, but here that really isn't the case. Starting with the graphics card, which can be up to 210 mils in length. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but that means that it can comfortably accommodate those RTX 2070 mini cards or the Zotac 1080 Ti Mini if you can still find one laying around. For storage, you can fit up to two 2.5-inch drives here, which can easily be mounted on the bracket. I believe that's going to be sufficient for most people. CPU cooling is probably the biggest compromise when it comes to the Skyreach 4 Mini. The cooler height maxes out at 45 millimeters, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that means you can still accommodate the Noctua L9i or L9A, depending on which CPU you go with, and that can comfortably cool an i5 or Ryzen 5 CPU. Again, for a gaming system, an i5 or a Ryzen 5 CPU is absolutely adequate for 95% of games. With a case like this, portability is really important. I imagine if you are buying the Skyreach 4 Mini, you'd want it to be extremely lightweight and also nice and strong as well. You definitely wouldn't want something like this being plastic. The other thing about the Skyreach 4 Mini that might throw a few people off is that it doesn't support an SFX power supply. This one only supports a smaller power supply. It's called the HD Plex 400AC, but thankfully with that model, you don't need to carry a power brick. I'll leave a link down below to where you can learn more about that. Now, priced at $199 US, I can see why a lot of people would not be interested in buying something like this because it is pretty expensive for what you're getting. But considering that it is uncontested, for example, no other case is 5 liters, can easily fit in a backpack like this. Also considering that it is a low volume case, that is, it isn't mass produced, that price is easier to justify. And we will get to the best budget ITX case category in just a minute, but first I want to show you guys the best performing case that I've had the chance to review. And here it is, the Ncase M1. I think I've done about 10 videos on this case so far just because it really just impresses me so much. At just 12.5 liters in volume, the Ncase M1 is kind of what started this trend of these premium ITX cases that prioritize hardware optimization. Now, some of you are wondering, why would I consider the Ncase M1 the best performance ITX case that I've reviewed? Simply put, cooling the CPU is the biggest challenge when it comes to these smaller cases, since you don't have room for very large coolers or a lot of radiator space. If there's one thing the Ncase M1 is good at though, it is CPU cooling. So starting with air cooling, you can fit up to a Noctua U9S or C14S. I've run both of those configurations and they do do run quite well. Liquid cooling is what really impresses me in this case though, and here it can fit up to a 240mm AIO, and if you combine that with bottom intake fans blowing air up into the case, this can run a 9900K overclock to 4.9 GHz at 1.25 volts. So if you guys are considering an ITX build for the upcoming Ryzen 3000 CPUs, that's the 12 core and the 16 core CPU, prioritizing cooling for those CPUs is going to be very, very important. And if you're looking for an ITX case to do it in, the NCase M1 should really be the top of your list. Seeing as it does support a 240mm side mounted radiator, it can also accommodate two 120mm AIOs. And that means that basically if you want to liquid cool both your CPU and GPU with separate 120mm radiators, that can be done quite easily. It does also fit up to 3 slot graphics cards as well. So those really thick 2080 Ti cards that are like 2.75 slots, the EVGA 2080 Ti XC Ultra, for example, that actually can fit in this case. Now look, both the Skyreach 4 Mini and the NCase M1 are wonderful cases, but they are expensive. Most people probably don't want to pay that much for a computer case. So here I've got what I consider two really good options if you don't want to spend a ton of money. Here we have the Cougar QBX, which you can buy for about 50 bucks. And here we have the Node 202, which is kind of like a console alternative. This goes for around 70 bucks. And the two drawbacks of that lower cost are that build quality and hardware optimization isn't going to be as good. For example, this compared to the NCase M1, the space optimization is kind of similar. You can fit similar components in this case, but it is 20 liters compared to 12.5 liters, and it is plastic, not aluminium. Still though, for $50 US, the Cougar QBX I would consider to be pretty damn good for the price. If you are looking to build a budget to mid-range ITX gaming machine, this is definitely one to consider. You can also water cool the Cougar QBX with a 240mm AIO or dual 120mm radiators, like I said, with the NCase M1, and that's done quite easily with the side bracket. And despite the side panels being plastic, I do actually think it looks pretty nice. It does have a nice dark gray brushed finish, which isn't going to attract fingerprints or scratches that easily. And coming in at around 10 liters, we have the Fractal Design Node 202. And if you wanted something like an Xbox or a PS4, for example, but you want a lot more power and you want to build a PC, this is a really good option. Again, you're not spending too much money here. 70 bucks, I think is pretty reasonable for this case. I've seen so many builds in this case, and really for a mid-range ITX gaming system, this does do the job. Next, let's talk about the best designed ITX case that I've reviewed. This one is a little bit heavier because it is housing my main machine, my main editing and gaming machine, and it is the Loki Ghost S1. So the big thing here is that we're not using sheet metal. This is actually extruded aluminum panels that allows the panels to be a lot thicker, resulting in an overall better build quality and a more premium feel. So with the base configuration, the Ghost S1 is just 8.2 liters and it does adopt a sandwich style layout. I'm a big fan of this layout where you've got your motherboard and your power supply on one compartment, and then you've got a separate compartment entirely for the GPU. But simply put, it's the most premium ITX case that I've reviewed, or it's the most premium case that I've reviewed. Even when it comes to mid towers or full tower ATX cases, nothing really comes to the premium feel and the build quality of the Ghost S1. Now, something I really love about the Ghost S1 is the modularity, and you see that I've got this little sort of segment here. It's a sort of a vertical extension of the case. Now, if you're not familiar with the Ghost S1, these are called top hats, and they're basically vertical extensions from the case, which you can add to the top or the bottom, where you can add additional cooling or storage. So as you can see from my personal system, I've got two 120mm fans running as exhaust, so pulling air up through the case, pushing all the hot air like that. That accelerates the air intake through the side panels, and it does improve the thermals for both the CPU and GPU by a noticeable amount. You can actually water cool the Ghost with a 240mm radiator as well with the large top hat. However, one thing to look out for there is that I've actually had experience with the large top hat where it actually bows inwards around the middle of the panel. I've seen that on both the black and the silver large top hat panel, so unless you really want to deal with that, I would personally stick to the small and medium top hats for now. The other thing that I love about the top hats is that it improves the overall lifespan of the case. For example, if you need a bigger case with more cooling or more storage, you don't have to upgrade your case and transplant your whole system. You can just add these top hats, throw in some more storage, throw in some more cooling if you need it, and that's basically it. Now let's look at what I would consider the best case for a gaming machine. That is, if you are building a high-end ITX gaming machine, you should really look no further than the Den A4. I feel like most of us would agree that you don't need a 9900K or a 2700X for a gaming machine, and if you want, you can actually run an i7 9700K, for example, in this thing with a liquid cooler. So yeah, believe it or not, you can actually liquid cool this thing with a 92mm AIO. Just be careful when it comes to cable management. Stock 24-pin cables are a bit of a nightmare to manage with that liquid cooler in there. The Den A4 can accommodate 2-slot graphics cards up to 295mm in length, so that means that you can potentially run a 2080 Ti in here. The Den A4 really popularized the sandwich style layout where you've got your GPU compartment separate from your motherboard and power supply. Honestly, it's hard to argue that hardware optimization really gets any better than what you have with this case. And honestly, for a gaming build, even a really high-end gaming machine, I don't think you need much more than what you've got here with the Den A4. So that is the majority of the list, but there is one more category that is probably the most important category and was probably the easiest for me to decide, and that's the best overall, and I've got to give it to the Ncase M1. Whether you're after a ton of storage or a ton of cooling, or if you want to build a full custom ITX loop, it can be done in the Ncase M1. And that's what I love here. 12.5 liters does hit that sweet spot for a nice compact desktop system, but you can also travel with it if you need to. For an overall no compromise small form factor system, you really can't go wrong with this case, and that's why it's so easy to recommend for the best overall category. One thing to note is that the V5, which is this one here, is actually being discontinued, but they are coming out with a V6, which offers a bit more ventilation and a couple more changes, I think maybe to the front IO. That should be out in around July, I believe. The Ncase M1 is really easy to recommend. It's hard to fault. Most configurations that you want to run will run in this case. Like I said, if you want to overclock a 9900K, the Ncase M1 can do it. It's super high airflow. The only problem that I've personally run into is running a 2080 Ti in this case, a 2-slot variant that is, where I did need to undervolt for things to run cool. But like I also said, you can also run 3-slot 2080 Ti's in this case, so you might not have the same issue as I did. So there's my list for what are the best ITX cases that I've ever reviewed and why. If you have any thoughts or comments, feel free to leave those down below and I will check those out. As always guys, a huge thanks for watching and I will see you all in the next one.